The morning of September 14, 2019 began like any other autumn Saturday in Philadelphia. The leaves along Walnut Street had just started their slow surrender to gold, and the air carried that particular crispness that only the northeastern United States knows how to deliver. The kind of morning that makes you believe the world is exactly as it appears to be, Doctor. Eleanor Mitchell parked her silver Honda Accord in the small lot behind the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the same spot she had occupied every weekend for the past 11 years. At 53, Eleanor had built her entire career on certainty. As a professor of American architectural history at the University of Pennsylvania, she had published 14 peer-reviewed papers, 2 acclaimed books, and had lectured in 12 countries. She knew buildings. She knew history. She knew what was real, or so she thought. The Society's building itself was a testament to the architectural grandeur of the late 19th century. Red brick, white marble trim, arched windows that caught the morning light in ways that modern architects had seemingly forgotten how to achieve. Eleanor had walked through its heavy oak doors hundreds of times, but on this particular morning, something felt different. A subtle shift in the air, perhaps. A frequency she could not name. Inside, the familiar smell of aged paper and wood polish greeted her like an old friend. The reading room was empty except for Marcus Chun, the weekend archivist, a quiet man in his 60s who had worked there longer than anyone could remember. He looked up from his desk as Eleanor approached, and she noticed something unusual in his expression. A hesitation. A question he seemed afraid to ask. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I found something in the basement last night, in a section I didn't know existed." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken slightly, though she told herself it was merely the excitement of potential discovery. What kind of something? Marcus glanced around the empty room as if checking for observers. "I think you need to see it for yourself." They descended 2 flights of stairs into the Society's basement archive, a labyrinth of metal shelving units and climate-controlled storage rooms that Eleanor knew intimately. But Marcus led her past the familiar sections, through a door she had somehow never noticed before, into a narrow corridor that smelled of dust and forgotten decades. At the end of the corridor stood a steel door, its surface covered in a thin layer of grime that suggested years of neglect. Marcus produced a key from his pocket, one that looked older than anything Eleanor had ever seen, its brass worn smooth by countless hands. "I found this in the personal effects of a former director who passed away in 1978, Marcus explained. There was a note with it. It said, 'Do not open until the world is ready to remember.'" The door swung open with a groan of protest, revealing a room no larger than a modest office. But what the room contained made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. Floor to ceiling, the walls were lined with wooden filing cabinets, their surfaces covered in handwritten labels that predated any organizational system the Society officially used. In the center of the room sat a large oak table, and upon that table lay a collection of documents, photographs, and architectural drawings that defied everything Eleanor thought she knew. She approached the table slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the first photograph. It showed Philadelphia's City Hall, unmistakable in its French Second Empire grandeur, but something was wrong. The photograph was dated 1871 in careful handwriting on its reverse side. City Hall's construction had not begun until 1871, and the building was not completed until 1901. Yet here was a photograph showing the structure fully complete, its tower rising against a sky that looked somehow different, somehow older. "That's impossible," Eleanor whispered. "Keep looking," Marcus replied. She turned to the architectural drawings beneath the photograph. They bore the seal of an organization she had never heard of, the Bureau of Inherited Structures, Philadelphia District. The drawings detailed City Hall's floor plans, but they included rooms that did not exist in any official record, passages that led to nowhere on any modern blueprint, and most disturbingly, notations in a language that resembled English but was not quite English. One notation, scrawled in faded ink beside what appeared to be the building's central tower, read, "Resonance chamber intact. Frequency calibration required before public occupation. Original harmonic signature, 432 Hz. Eleanor had no idea what this meant, but something about the phrase stirred a memory she could not quite grasp. A lecture she had attended years ago, perhaps. A footnote in a book she had skimmed and forgotten. Something about the way buildings used to be constructed, before modern methods standardized everything into efficient, soulless boxes. "There's more," Marcus said, pulling open one of the filing cabinet drawers. Much more. Inside the drawer were hundreds of photographs, each one more impossible than the last. The Boston State House, fully constructed in a photograph dated 1785, 7 years before its official completion. The United States Capitol building, standing complete against a pristine sky in an image labeled 1812. Despite the fact that the building was famously burned by British forces in 1814 and not fully rebuilt until decades later. The San Francisco City Hall, photographed in what appeared to be perfect condition in 1890, when records clearly showed its construction did not begin until 1913, and beneath the photographs, document after document describing something called the Reset Protocol. Eleanor's academic training screamed at her to dismiss this as an elaborate hoax. Someone had clearly gone to extraordinary lengths to create these forgeries, to plant them in this hidden room, to wait for someone naive enough to believe them. But as she examined the photographs more closely, she noticed details that no forger could have anticipated. The chemical composition of the photographic paper was consistent with 19th-century manufacturing processes. The ink on the documents had faded in patterns that only genuine age could produce. The handwriting styles matched samples from confirmed historical figures of the periods indicated. If these were forgeries, they were the most sophisticated Eleanor had ever encountered, and if they were genuine, she could not complete that thought. Not yet. Has anyone else seen this? She asked Marcus. The archivist shook his head slowly. I came in early yesterday to work on the cataloging backlog. I was moving some boxes when I found the key in the note. I spent all night going through these files. Dr. Mitchell, I don't understand what I'm looking at, but I know it's important. I know it changes everything. Eleanor looked around the room, at the filing cabinets stretching toward the ceiling, at the decades of hidden knowledge waiting to be discovered. She thought about her career, her reputation, the 14 peer-reviewed papers that suddenly seemed like fairy tales told to children. She thought about the buildings she had studied for 30 years, the official history she had taught to thousands of students, the certainty she had worn like armor against the chaos of an uncertain world. And then she thought about truth. We need to document everything, she said finally. Photograph every page, catalog every file, and we need to be careful, Marcus. Very careful. Because if this is real, if any of this is real, then someone went to enormous trouble to hide it. And whoever that someone was, they might still be watching. Marcus nodded, his face pale but determined. Where do we start? Eleanor reached for the first file in the nearest cabinet. The label read, Chicago, 1871. The Fire That Wasn't. She opened the file and began to read. And as she read, the world she thought she knew began to crumble, piece by piece, like a building demolished by invisible hands. The documents inside described a Chicago that existed before the Great Fire, not the modest frontier town of official history, but a metropolis of stunning grandeur. Photographs showed buildings of white marble and red granite, their facades adorned with intricate carvings and copper domes that gleamed in the Midwestern sun. The architecture was impossibly sophisticated for the 1850s and 1860s, featuring techniques and materials that, according to mainstream historical records, had not been developed until decades later. One photograph in particular caught Eleanor's attention. It showed the intersection of State Street and Madison Street, the heart of modern Chicago. But instead of the modest wooden structures that fire had supposedly destroyed, the image revealed a grand boulevard lined with buildings that would not have looked out of place in Paris or Vienna. Ornate lampposts lined the streets, their design suggesting an electrical illumination that officially did not exist until the 1880s, and in the distance, rising above the other structures, stood a tower of glass and iron that resembled nothing Eleanor had ever seen in any architectural archive. The caption beneath the photograph read, Central Resonance Tower, Chicago District. Constructed 1847. Dismantled during the transition, 1871. Dismantled during the transition. Not destroyed by fire. Dismantled. Eleanor felt the room spin around her. She gripped the edge of the table for support, her mind racing to process information that contradicted everything she had spent her life studying. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 was one of the most documented events in American history. Thousands of eyewitness accounts described the flames that swept through the city, destroying 18,000 buildings and leaving 100,000 people homeless. The fire was real. It had to be real. But the documents in her hand suggested otherwise. They described not a fire but a coordinated demolition, a systematic dismantling of structures that had stood for decades or perhaps centuries. They spoke of inherited architecture being replaced with authorized construction, of resonance networks being severed and frequency channels being sealed. They mentioned something called the Council of Transition and referenced instructions from an organization identified only as the Historical Revision Bureau, Marcus, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. How many filing cabinets are in this room? The archivist counted quickly. 47. And how many files in each cabinet? Approximately 200, based on the drawers I've opened. Eleanor did the math. Nearly 10,000 files. 10,000 pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, might reveal a picture of American history, completely different from anything she had ever imagined. She knew she should walk away. She should close the door, return the key to its hiding place, and pretend this room did not exist. That would be the safe choice, the sensible choice, the choice that would protect her career and her sanity and her comfortable understanding of reality. But Eleanor Mitchell had not become a scholar by choosing comfort over truth. And somewhere deep within her, beneath the layers of academic training and professional caution, a small voice whispered that she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. Waiting for the locked door to open. Waiting for permission to remember. We have a lot of work to do, she said to Marcus. And we need to start immediately. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because every week we uncover truths that have been buried for generations, and those who are not subscribed miss the revelations that change everything. Join the thousands who have chosen to see beyond the official story. Subscribe now and become part of the awakening. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor Mitchell first descended into that hidden archive. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, of photographs spread across her kitchen table, of questions that multiplied faster than answers could be found. She had taken a leave of absence from the university, citing personal reasons, and had devoted every waking hour to the impossible task before her. Marcus Chun had become her partner in this investigation, his quiet dedication proving invaluable as they catalogued file after file, photograph after photograph, document after document. They worked in shifts, one of them always present in the hidden room while the other rested or researched in the outside world. They had developed a system of coded messages to communicate, a precaution that Eleanor initially dismissed as paranoid but now accepted as necessary, because someone was watching. Eleanor first noticed it on the 5th day, when she returned to her apartment in West Philadelphia to find her front door slightly ajar. Nothing had been taken, but subtle signs of intrusion were everywhere. Books had been moved on her shelves, their positions altered by centimeters that only an obsessive academic would notice. Her computer's browser history had been cleared, though she had not cleared it herself. And on her kitchen counter, placed precisely in the center like a message, sat a single photograph. The photograph showed Eleanor herself, taken from across the street, walking into the Historical Society. On the back, written in neat block letters, was a single word: remember. She had not called the police. What would she tell them? That someone was trying to frighten her into abandoning research they could not possibly know about? That she had discovered a secret archive that challenged the foundations of American history? They would think her delusional, and perhaps she was. Perhaps this was all an elaborate hallucination, a break from reality triggered by stress and overwork. But the photographs did not lie, and the patterns she had begun to see were too consistent, too coherent, too vast to be the product of a single disturbed mind. The pattern had first emerged when Eleanor compared photographs from different cities: Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, San Francisco, New Orleans, Detroit. Each city had its own collection of impossible images, its own cache of documents describing events that had never officially happened. But when she arranged the photographs chronologically, something remarkable appeared. In every city, regardless of size or location, the buildings followed the same architectural principles, the same proportions, the same geometric relationships, the same ornamental vocabulary of domes and arches and columns that seemed designed not merely for beauty but for function. It was as if the entire continent had been constructed according to a single master plan, a unified vision of urban development that transcended regional differences and local materials. And in every city, that architecture had been systematically removed during a narrow window of time. Between 1870 and 1915, according to the documents, something called the transition had swept across America, replacing the inherited structures with the buildings that would become the official historical record. Fires, floods, earthquakes, urban renewal projects. The cover stories varied, but the result was always the same. The old world disappeared and a new world took its place. But why? Who could possibly have coordinated such a massive undertaking, and what were they trying to hide? Eleanor found the first hint of an answer in a file labeled Educational Reform, 1890 to 1920. Inside were documents describing a systematic revision of school curricula, a nationwide effort to standardize historical education in ways that would ensure future generations never questioned the official narrative. Textbooks were recalled and replaced. Teachers were trained in new methodologies. Students were taught to memorize dates and names rather than to question sources and evidence. One document, a memorandum from the Historical Revision Bureau dated March 17, 1893, stated the goal explicitly: the population must be convinced that the current built environment represents organic development from primitive origins. Any suggestion of advanced antecedent civilization must be classified as fantasy or delusion. The success of the transition depends on complete generational amnesia within 3 cycles. 3 generations. Roughly 90 years. By the 1980s, according to this plan, no one would be alive who remembered the world before the transition. And no one would question the history they had been taught, because questioning would be literally unthinkable. The vocabulary of doubt would have been erased along with the evidence. Eleanor thought about her own education, the history classes she had taken in elementary school and high school and college. She'd learned about westward expansion and manifest destiny, about pioneers building log cabins in the wilderness, about the gradual development of American cities from humble origins to modern grandeur. She had never questioned these narratives because they were simply the way things were, foundation upon which all other knowledge rested. But what if the foundation was false? What if the log cabins and the humble origins and the gradual development were all elements of a story created specifically to be believed? What if the true history of America was something far more magnificent and far more troubling? Marcus arrived at the archive that evening with news that confirmed Eleanor's growing suspicions. He had spent the day at the Library of Congress in Washington searching for references to the organizations mentioned in the Philadelphia documents. What he found was simultaneously encouraging and disturbing. "There's nothing," he said, setting down a folder of photocopied records. "I searched every database, every card catalog, every archive index, the Bureau of Inherited Structures, the Historical Revision Bureau, the Council of Transition. None of them appear in any official record. It's like they never existed, or like someone made sure they would never be found," Eleanor replied. "But here's the strange part." Marcus opened his folder and spread the photocopies across the table. "I searched for the names of individuals mentioned in our documents. Administrators, engineers, architects. Most of them don't appear anywhere either. But a few of them do, and when they do, their biographical information has obvious gaps." He pointed to a photocopy of a biographical entry from an 1895 encyclopedia. "This is William Thornton. According to our documents, he was the chief architect for the Bureau of Inherited Structures in the Philadelphia district. According to this encyclopedia, he was a prominent citizen who died in 1892. No mention of his profession. No mention of any buildings he designed. Just prominent citizen and a death date." Eleanor examined the entry. It was remarkably sparse for someone described as prominent. Just 2 sentences where similar entries for less notable figures ran to full paragraphs, as if someone had removed information rather than adding it. "How many gaps like this did you find?" she asked. 17 in the initial search, and each one corresponds to a name in our files. Someone went through the historical record and scrubbed these people's professional histories. They left enough information to make the individuals seem real, but not enough to connect them to anything we're researching. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. This was not the work of amateurs or pranksters. This was systematic, professional, comprehensive. Whoever had organized the transition had also organized the covering of their tracks, and they had done so with a thoroughness that suggested enormous resources and unlimited time. "There's something else," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to near whisper. When I was leaving the Library of Congress, a woman approached me in the parking lot. She was in her 70s, well-dressed, with white hair and very clear blue eyes. She asked if I had found what I was looking for. "What did you tell her?" I said I was researching my family genealogy. Standard cover story. But she smiled at me like she knew I was lying, and then she said something I can't stop thinking about. She said, "The archives remember what the textbooks forgot. Be careful which memories you choose to wake." Eleanor and Marcus stared at each other across the table. Surrounded by documents that should not exist, in a room that had been hidden for decades, investigating a conspiracy that spanned generations. "We're not alone in this," Eleanor said finally. "Someone else knows. Maybe many people know. The question is whether they're trying to help us or stop us." She reached for the next file in the cabinet, a thick folder labeled San Francisco, 1906. The event that changed everything. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 was one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in American history. Occurring on April 18th at 5:12 in the morning, the earthquake and resulting fires destroyed over 80% of the city, killed an estimated 3,000 people, and left half the population homeless. It was a tragedy of almost incomprehensible proportions, studied by seismologists and historians for over a century. But the documents in Eleanor's hands told a different story. According to the files, San Francisco in 1905 was not merely a prosperous gold rush city, but a marvel of advanced architecture and engineering that rivaled anything in Europe or Asia. The city possessed a network of underground passages connecting its major buildings. Passages lined with materials that conducted energy in ways the documents described as harmonic transfer systems. The famous cable cars were not the primitive transit system of official history, but a remnant of a far more sophisticated transportation network that had once connected the entire Bay Area. And the earthquake had not been natural. A memorandum dated January 3, 1906, from someone identified only as Director K, described the upcoming San Francisco transition in clinical detail. The existing structures were to be destabilized through coordinated subsurface displacement, a process that would simulate a natural seismic event while actually involving the deliberate destruction of specific buildings and infrastructure. The population would be evacuated under emergency protocols. The fires would be allowed to burn until the target structures were eliminated, and the subsequent reconstruction would follow approved architectural guidelines that eliminated all traces of the inherited technology. Eleanor set down the memorandum, her hands trembling. If this document was authentic, then one of the greatest natural disasters in American history had been deliberately engineered. Thousands of people had died not because of geological forces beyond human control, but because someone had decided that certain buildings needed to be destroyed. Certain knowledge needed to be erased. Certain memories needed to be forgotten. Why? She whispered to the empty room. Why would anyone do this? The answer, she suspected, lay somewhere in the remaining files, and she was determined to find it no matter how long it took, no matter what dangers awaited. 6 weeks into her investigation, Eleanor Mitchell stood before the largest collection of evidence she had ever assembled. Her apartment had been transformed into a war room, with photographs and documents covering every available surface, connected by strings of red yarn that traced the relationships between cities, dates, events, and individuals. The pattern was undeniable now. Between 1870 and 1915, a coordinated effort had systematically replaced the architectural heritage of the United States. City after city had experienced catastrophic events: fires and earthquakes and floods and urban renewal projects, each one conveniently eliminating structures that shared certain characteristics, buildings with specific proportions, buildings constructed from particular materials, buildings that, according to the documents, had been designed to harness and transmit energy in ways that modern science did not acknowledge. But Eleanor had also discovered something else, something that gave her hope amid the overwhelming evidence of deception. She was not the first person to uncover this truth. Throughout the decades, others had stumbled upon fragments of the hidden history and had tried to preserve what they found. Some had been silenced. Some had been discredited. Some had simply disappeared. But a few had managed to pass their knowledge forward, hiding documents in archives, encoding information in academic papers, waiting for the day when someone would finally assemble all the pieces. Marcus had found evidence of this network in the correspondence files. Letters exchanged between researchers across decades, each one adding another fragment to the puzzle. They called themselves the Rememberers, and their stated mission was simple: to preserve the truth until the world was ready to receive it. One letter, dated 1962, was addressed to the director of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. It read, "The time approaches when the transition will complete its final phase. The generation that remembers has nearly passed. Within 20 years, no living witness will remain. We must ensure that the physical evidence survives even if human memory does not. I am entrusting to your care the Philadelphia collection. Guard it well, and when the seeker arrives, give them the key." The seeker. Eleanor wondered if that was what she had become. Not a scholar pursuing academic knowledge, but a seeker of something far more profound. A truth that had been buried so deeply that even the concept of its existence had been erased from public consciousness. She thought about all the times she had looked at old photographs of American cities and felt a strange sense of loss, a nostalgia for a world she had never known. She thought about the buildings she passed every day, the modern structures of glass and steel that seemed somehow hollow compared to the ornate facades of the 19th century. She thought about the way people moved through cities now, disconnected from each other and from the spaces they inhabited. as if the very architecture around them had been designed to isolate rather than connect. What if that feeling of loss was not imagination but memory? What if somewhere deep within the human psyche, buried beneath layers of education and conditioning, the knowledge of what had been taken still survived? Marcus arrived that evening with a discovery that would change everything. He had been researching the architectural firm that had designed many of Philadelphia's replacement buildings, the structures that had been constructed after the transition to fill the spaces left by the inherited architecture. The firm had been prolific, designing dozens of major buildings between 1890 and 1920, yet very little information about its founders or methods had survived. Marcus had found something. In a dusty corner of a private library in Germantown, he had discovered the personal journal of one of the firm's junior architects, a young man named Thomas Garrett, who had joined the company in 1895 and left abruptly in 1902. "Listen to this," Marcus said, opening the journal to a marked page. Entry dated March 15, 1898. "Today I was shown the plans for the new courthouse. They are magnificent in their mediocrity, designed specifically to inspire nothing, to connect to nothing, to remember nothing. Mr. Harrison explained that this is the purpose of our work. Not to create beauty, but to replace it. Not to build monuments, but to build forgetting. And I fear I cannot stop finding." Eleanor took the journal from Marcus and read the subsequent entries. Thomas Garrett had become obsessed with understanding what his firm was doing and why. He had secretly copied documents, photographed plans, and interviewed older architects who remembered the buildings that had been demolished. He had assembled a collection of evidence that mirrored what Eleanor herself had found, though on a smaller scale. And then in the entry dated November 3, 1902, the journal abruptly ended. The final words read, "They know. I must hide what I have found. If you are reading this, then I have failed to return. Look for the truth where the resonance still hums. The old library, the chamber beneath, the frequency that cannot be silenced." Thomas Garrett had never been seen again. His disappearance was recorded as a suicide, though no body was ever found. His personal effects had been donated to the Germantown Library by a distant relative, where they had sat undisturbed for over a century. "Until now, the old library," Eleanor repeated. He must mean the original Philadelphia Library Company building. "It was demolished in 1880, but she stopped, a realization dawning. The Library Company had moved to a new building in 1880, but before the move there had been rumors of underground chambers beneath the original structure, chambers that had never been officially documented or explored. The original site is now a parking lot," Marcus said, "behind the current Federal Reserve Bank building." Eleanor felt her heart racing. If Thomas Garrett had hidden evidence beneath the old library, and if that evidence had survived the demolition and the decades of development above it, then it might still be there, waiting, remembering. "We need to go there," she said. Tonight. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia occupied an imposing neoclassical structure on Chestnut Street, its massive columns and stern facade projecting an image of stability and authority. Behind it, a modest parking lot served the bank's employees during business hours. At 2 a.m, it was empty and dark, illuminated only by a few security lights and the distant glow of the city. Eleanor and Marcus approached cautiously, carrying equipment they had assembled over the past weeks. Ground-penetrating radar borrowed from a colleague in the geology department. Flashlights, a small excavation kit, and a camera to document whatever they might find. The radar revealed what Eleanor had hoped to see, a void beneath the parking lot's surface. Approximately 15 feet down, with dimensions that suggested a constructed space rather than a natural cavity. Someone had built a chamber here, and someone had carefully hidden it from all subsequent development. They found the entrance hidden beneath a drainage grate in the corner of the lot, a narrow shaft that descended into darkness. The shaft was lined with bricks that predated the parking lot by at least a century, their surfaces worn smooth by time but still structurally sound. Eleanor descended first, her flashlight cutting through the blackness below. The shaft opened into a small antechamber, its walls covered with symbols she did not recognize, but which stirred something deep in her memory. Beyond the antechamber, a corridor stretched into the darkness, its ceiling supported by arches of remarkable precision. And at the end of the corridor they found it. The chamber was circular, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rose to a point directly above its center. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat hundreds of objects, books, documents, photographs, mechanical devices of unknown purpose, and at the very center of the room, on a pedestal of white marble, a sphere of crystal that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Eleanor approached the sphere slowly, her breath visible in the cold air of the underground chamber. As she drew closer, she became aware of a sound, so faint that it was almost imperceptible, a low hum that seemed to emanate from the sphere itself. The sound was strangely familiar, like a melody she had heard in childhood and forgotten, like a voice calling her name across an impossible distance. She reached out and touched the sphere, and in that moment Eleanor Mitchell understood everything. The knowledge fluttered into her mind like water breaking through a dam. She saw the world as it had been, a world of cities connected by networks of energy, of buildings designed not merely as shelter but as instruments of harmony, of a civilization that had achieved balance between technology and nature, between progress and preservation, between the individual and the collective. She saw the transition, the deliberate destruction of that world by forces who feared what humanity might become if it remembered its true potential. She saw the fires and the earthquakes and the floods, not as natural disasters but as acts of erasure, each one eliminating another fragment of the inherited knowledge. She saw the construction of the replacement world, the gray and hollow structures designed to disconnect humans from each other and from the resonance that had once united them. And she saw the rememberers, generation after generation, hiding fragments of truth in archives and libraries and underground chambers, waiting for the day when the world would be ready to wake. And at this moment I need to ask you something. If you feel what Eleanor felt in that chamber, if you sense that there is more to our world than what we have been taught, then leave a comment with the words, "I am ready to remember." Because only those who are ready will find the truth. And I need to know who you are. Eleanor emerged from the underground chamber as the first light of dawn painted the Philadelphia skyline in shades of gold and rose. She carried with her a single book from the shelves below, a leather-bound volume that Thomas Garrett had titled The Complete Record of the Philadelphia Transition. Marcus walked beside her in silence, his face pale with the weight of what they had witnessed. Neither of them spoke as they made their way through the waking city, past buildings that now seemed like monuments to forgetting, past people who moved through their daily routines unaware of the history that had been stolen from them. Back in Eleanor's apartment, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the book between them like an artifact from another world, which, in a sense, it was. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked finally. Eleanor considered the question. She thought about her career, her reputation, the comfortable life she had built on foundations that had proven to be lies. She thought about the danger they had already encountered, the warning photograph left on her counter, the mysterious woman who had spoken to Marcus at the Library of Congress. She thought about Thomas Garrett, who had sought the same truth and had disappeared without a trace. And she thought about the millions of people who lived their lives in ignorance, disconnected from their heritage, cut off from the knowledge that could transform their understanding of what humanity had been and what it could become again. "We tell the truth," she said, carefully, strategically. "We find others who are ready to hear it, and we share what we've found. We become rememberers ourselves." Over the following months, Eleanor and Marcus worked to document their discoveries in a way that could withstand academic scrutiny while also reaching a broader audience. They photographed every document in the hidden archive, created detailed catalogs of the evidence, and began reaching out to colleagues who had expressed unconventional views about architectural history. The response was both encouraging and frightening. For every scholar who listened with genuine interest, there were 3 who dismissed their findings as fantasy or delusion. For every journalist who agreed to examine their evidence, there were 5 who refused to even return their calls. And on 3 separate occasions, Eleanor returned home to find signs that her apartment had been searched again, each time with a new warning photograph waiting on her counter. But they also found allies. Dr. Samuel Okonkwo, a professor of African American Studies at Howard University, had been researching similar anomalies in the architectural history of Washington, D.C. His findings paralleled Eleanor's in remarkable ways, describing a pre-transition capital city of stunning grandeur that had been systematically replaced during the same period. Together they began mapping the connections between their discoveries, revealing a pattern that extended far beyond any single city or region. Dr. Maria Santos, an architectural historian from the University of New Mexico, had documented similar evidence in the American Southwest. The Spanish missions of California and Arizona, she argued, had not been constructed by colonial settlers as official history claimed, but had been inherited from a previous civilization and subsequently attributed to the Spanish to fit the approved narrative. Her photographs showed architectural details that predated any European presence on the continent, designs that matched the patterns Eleanor had found in Philadelphia, and Dr. Chun Wei, a retired engineer from MIT, had spent decades quietly researching the technical specifications of pre-transition buildings. His analysis revealed that the inherited structures had been designed according to principles of acoustic resonance and electromagnetic harmony that modern science was only beginning to rediscover. The buildings had not merely been beautiful, they had been functional in ways that the replacement architecture could never replicate. They disconnected us, Dr. Chun explained during a video call with the growing research group. The old buildings were part of a network, each one tuned to specific frequencies that allowed energy to flow between them. When they destroyed those buildings, they didn't just erase history. They cut off humanity's access to a form of technology that we are only now beginning to understand. Eleanor thought about the crystal sphere in the underground chamber, the way it had seemed to communicate directly with her consciousness, the flood of knowledge that had filled her mind when she touched it. She had not told the others about that experience, uncertain how to describe something so far outside the bounds of normal reality. But she understood now that the sphere had been part of that network, a node in a system that had once connected the entire continent. Can it be restored, she asked, the network? Can we rebuild what was destroyed? Dr. Chun was silent for a long moment. Perhaps, he said finally, but it would require resources we don't have, knowledge that has been scattered and hidden, and most importantly, it would require people to remember, to believe that something better is possible. The transition didn't just destroy buildings. It destroyed the collective memory of what those buildings represented. Before we can rebuild the physical network, we have to rebuild the network of minds, Eleanor understood. The true work ahead was not archaeological or architectural. It was psychological, educational, spiritual. They needed to help people remember what had been taken from them, to awaken the dormant knowledge that still survived somewhere in the human psyche, waiting to be activated. She looked at the book on her table, at the photographs covering her walls, at the faces of her colleagues on the computer screen. They were a small group, scattered across the country, working against forces that had successfully hidden the truth for over a century. The odds against them were overwhelming. But they were rememberers now, and rememberers did not give up. 1 year after Eleanor Mitchell first descended into the hidden archive, she stood before an audience of 300 people in a rented auditorium in downtown Philadelphia. The crowd was diverse, ranging from academics and researchers to curious members of the public who had heard rumors of her discoveries and wanted to know more. Behind her, a large screen displayed photographs from the archive, images of a world that official history insisted had never existed. Eleanor had spent months preparing this presentation, carefully selecting evidence that could not be easily dismissed, arranging it in a sequence that led viewers step by step from skepticism to wonder. What I am about to show you, she began, will challenge everything you think you know about American history. Some of you will reject it immediately, and I understand that impulse. We are trained from childhood to accept certain narratives as truth, and questioning those narratives can feel like questioning our own identity. She clicked to the first photograph, an image of Philadelphia's City Hall dated 1871. But I ask you to look at this evidence with fresh eyes, to set aside what you have been taught and simply observe what the photographs show. Because the truth is not hidden in secret vaults or classified documents. It is hiding in plain sight, in the architecture all around us, in the anomalies that we have been trained to ignore for the next 2 hours. Eleanor walked her audience through the evidence she had assembled. She showed them the photographs from multiple cities, pointing out the architectural consistencies that suggested a unified design philosophy. She presented the documents describing the transition, explaining the systematic nature of the destruction and replacement. She shared the stories of the rememberers, the generations of researchers who had preserved fragments of truth against impossible odds. And she told them about Thomas Garrett, the young architect who had sacrificed everything to hide evidence for future generations, whose journal had led her to the underground chamber in the crystal sphere that had changed her understanding of reality. I cannot prove everything I have told you tonight, Eleanor concluded. The evidence I have presented is compelling, but it is not complete. There are gaps in the record, questions that remain unanswered, mysteries that may never be fully solved. But I believe that the truth is more powerful than the lies that have been built around it, and I believe that we, together, can begin the work of remembering. The audience sat in silence for a long moment after she finished. Eleanor felt her heart pounding, uncertain how her words had been received. She had risked everything to give this presentation, her career, her reputation, possibly her safety. If the audience rejected her, if they dismissed her as a conspiracy theorist or a fraud, then all her work would have been for nothing. Then slowly a woman in the front row stood up. She was perhaps 70 years old, with white hair and clear blue eyes that seemed familiar. Eleanor realized with a start that this was the same woman who had spoken to Marcus at the Library of Congress, the one who had warned him about waking memories. "Dr. Mitchell," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "my name is Catherine Aldridge. I have been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." She reached into her purse and withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age. "My grandmother was a rememberer. She passed this letter to my mother, and my mother passed it to me with instructions to deliver it when the seeker finally arrived. I believe that seeker is you." Eleanor descended from the stage and accepted the envelope with trembling hands. The seal on the back bore an emblem she recognized from the documents in the archive, a geometric pattern that represented the resonance network described in Thomas Garrett's notes. "Open it," Catherine said. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, covered in handwriting that was faded but still legible. The letter was dated August 12, 1894, and it was addressed to the one who will remember. Eleanor read aloud, "If you are reading this letter, then the long silence is ending. The transition believed it could erase us from history, but truth cannot be destroyed, only hidden. We have hidden ourselves in the archives of every city, in the foundations of every building they could not destroy, in the memories of every family that refused to forget. We are everywhere, and we have been waiting. The time of awakening is near. The resonance that connected us still exists, dormant but not dead. It can be restored, but only by those who remember. Find the chambers beneath the great buildings. Find the spheres that still hum with the old frequency. Find each other. And when you have found all these things, speak the truth, not to convince the skeptics, for they will never believe, but to awaken those who are ready, those who have felt the loss without knowing what was lost, those who have dreamed of a world more beautiful than the one they know. We are the rememberers, and through you, we will remember again." Eleanor looked up from the letter to find the entire audience on their feet. Some were weeping, some were embracing strangers beside them, and all of them, every single one, wore expressions that Eleanor recognized. The look of people who had just discovered that their deepest intuitions were not fantasy but memory. Catherine Aldridge smiled at her. "The awakening has begun, Dr. Mitchell. What will you do with it?" Eleanor thought about all the work that lay ahead, the evidence that still needed to be gathered, the networks that needed to be rebuilt, the minds that needed to be opened, the world that needed to remember. "Everything," she said. "I will do everything." 5 years later, Eleanor Mitchell stood on the observation deck of Philadelphia's City Hall, looking out over a city transformed. Not physically, the buildings remained as they had always been, monuments to the transition's attempt to erase the past, but the energy of the city had changed. The people moving through the streets below walked differently now, looked at their surroundings with new eyes, asked questions that would have seemed insane just a few years earlier. The movement had grown beyond anything Eleanor could have imagined. What had begun as a small group of researchers meeting in secret had become a global phenomenon, with chapters in every major city on every continent. The evidence she had discovered in the Philadelphia archive had been corroborated by findings in London and Paris, in Moscow and Beijing, in Cairo and Mumbai. The transition, it turned out, had not been limited to America. It had been worldwide. And everywhere the rememberers searched, they found the same patterns, the same architectural principles, the same deliberate destruction, the same systematic erasure of knowledge, the same underground chambers hidden beneath parking lots and modern buildings waiting to be rediscovered. The crystal spheres were the key. Dr. Chunwei had finally decoded their function, using instruments sensitive enough to detect the frequencies they emitted. The spheres were nodes in a communication network that predated any technology modern science could explain, a network that allowed information and energy to flow between distant points without wires or satellites or any visible connection. When the transition destroyed the buildings that had housed the spheres, they had severed the network. But the spheres themselves had survived, hidden by the rememberers in underground chambers around the world. Now, one by one, the spheres were being reconnected. Eleanor felt the difference every time another node came online. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in her perception, a heightened sense of connection to the people and places around her. But as more spheres were activated, the effect grew stronger. She could feel the thoughts and emotions of other rememberers, not as words or images, but as a kind of resonance, a shared frequency that united them across all distances. The authorities had tried to stop them, of course. In the early years, there had been raids on their meetings, confiscation of their evidence, attempts to discredit their research through media campaigns. But the movement had grown too large to suppress. For every researcher who was silenced, 10 more emerged to take their place. For every document that was confiscated, 100 copies had already been distributed. The truth, once released, could not be contained. And now, on this autumn evening, Eleanor was preparing to take the final step. In the basement of City Hall, in a chamber that had been sealed since the building's official completion in 1901, a crystal sphere awaited activation. This sphere was larger than any they had found before, nearly 3 feet in diameter. And Dr. Chun believed it was the central node of the North American network. Once activated, it would reconnect dozens of smaller nodes across the continent, restoring a significant portion of the original resonance grid. Marcus Chun stood beside her, older now, but still her steadfast partner in the work they had undertaken together. Behind them, a crowd of rememberers had gathered to witness the moment, representatives from chapters across the country who had traveled to Philadelphia for this historic occasion. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked. Eleanor thought about all the years that had led to this moment, the hidden archive, the underground chambers, the letters from researchers long dead, the crystal sphere that had first opened her mind to the truth, the thousands of people who had joined the movement, risking their careers and their safety to remember what had been forgotten. "I've been ready my whole life," she said. "I just didn't know it until now." She descended the stairs into the basement, her footsteps echoing in the stone corridor. The chamber at the end had been carefully prepared, its walls cleaned of a century of dust, its floor cleared of the debris that had accumulated since the transition. In the center of the room, on a pedestal identical to the one she had found in the old library chamber, the great sphere waited. Eleanor approached slowly, aware of the weight of the moment. Behind her she heard the quiet breathing of the witnesses, the soft hum of anticipation that filled the air. She thought about Thomas Garrett, who had hidden evidence for her to find. She thought about Catherine Aldridge's grandmother, who had written a letter to a seeker she would never meet. She thought about all the rememberers across all the generations, keeping the truth alive against impossible odds. She placed her hands on the sphere. The hum began immediately, low at first, but quickly building to a frequency that seemed to resonate with every cell in her body. Eleanor felt the connection spreading outward from the sphere, reaching across the city, across the state, across the continent. She felt other spheres awakening in response, their dormant frequencies rising to meet the signal from Philadelphia. She felt the minds of rememberers everywhere joining in a chorus of shared consciousness that transcended all barriers of distance and time. And she felt something else, something vast and ancient and impossibly beautiful. The network itself, awakening from its long sleep, remembering what it had been designed to do. The chamber filled with light. When Eleanor opened her eyes, she found herself standing not in a basement, but in a space that seemed to exist beyond physical location. The other rememberers were there with her, their forms translucent but clearly visible, their faces alight with wonder. And before them, stretching into infinite distance, was the network in its full glory, a web of light connecting points across the entire planet, pulsing with energy that had been dormant for over a century. A voice spoke, not with words but with meaning that formed directly in Eleanor's consciousness. "You have remembered," the voice said. "You have awakened what was sleeping. The transition tried to sever us from our heritage, but heritage cannot be destroyed. It can only be hidden. And now, at last, it is hidden no more." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, though she was not aware of crying. The emotion was too vast for tears, too profound for any physical expression. She was witnessing the restoration of something sacred, something that had been stolen from humanity and was now being returned. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you teach," the voice replied. "Now you share. Now you help others remember what they have forgotten. The network will support you, will connect you, will amplify your efforts. But the work must be done by human hands and human hearts. The transition was a human choice, and its reversal must also be a human choice. You must choose to remember. You must choose to rebuild. You must choose to become what you were always meant to be." The light began to fade, but the connection remained. Eleanor felt it humming in her bones, a constant reminder of the network that now linked her to rememberers around the world. She opened her eyes to find herself back in the basement chamber, surrounded by witnesses who bore the same expression of awe and wonder that she knew was reflected on her own face. Marcus took her hand. "What did you see?" Eleanor smiled, feeling the resonance flowing through her, connecting her to everyone in the room and to everyone beyond it who had chosen to remember. "Everything," she said. "I saw everything. And now we share it with the world." In the months that followed, the world began to change. The evidence that the rememberers had gathered could no longer be ignored. Mainstream historians began examining the anomalies that Eleanor and her colleagues had documented, and many reached conclusions that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The transition was no longer a fringe theory, but a subject of serious academic debate. More importantly, people were waking up. Not just the researchers and the scholars, but ordinary people who had always sensed that something was missing from their understanding of history. They came to the Remembers with questions, with photographs found in attics and letters discovered in family archives, with memories passed down through generations that did not match the official story. And the network grew stronger every day. Eleanor Mitchell, professor of architectural history turned leader of a global awakening, often returned to the observation deck of City Hall to watch the sun set over Philadelphia. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the hidden archive to the underground chambers to the activation of the Great Sphere. She thought about the work that remained, the millions of people who still needed to remember, the structures of deception that still needed to be dismantled. But most of all, she thought about truth. The simple, powerful, unstoppable truth that could be hidden but never destroyed, that could be forgotten but never erased, that would always find its way back to the surface no matter how deep it had been buried. The transition had tried to keep humanity in the dark, but the knowledge of what we once were and what we could become again was stronger than any conspiracy, any cover-up, any century of lies. The truth was remembering itself, and nothing would ever silence it again. If you watched this far, it's because you felt something. You felt the resonance of truth that cannot be hidden forever. You are one of the Rememberers now. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really connects with these stories. Because this channel exists for people like you, people who sense that there is more to our world than what we have been told. If this story touched you, if it made you question what you thought you knew, then please give it a like. That simple action helps others find these truths. And share this video with someone who is ready to remember. Not everyone is ready, but you know who in your life has been asking the same questions, feeling the same disconnection from the official story. Share this with them. Help them begin their own awakening. Finally, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell, because this is just the beginning. Every week we uncover another layer of the hidden history, another fragment of the knowledge that was taken from us, and those who are subscribed are the first to remember. The truth is waking up, and so are we.